In 1843, a wagon train cook fed 40 people for 6 months with nothing but a cast iron skillet, a sack of cornmeal, and whatever the hunters dragged back to camp. No refrigeration, no grocery stores, no recipes written down, just firelight and instinct. Number 18 on this list was so critical, the United States Army printed instructions for it in field manuals. And number 7 uses a technique modern food scientists say produces a chemical reaction your kitchen oven cannot replicate. These 25 recipes kept pioneers alive across 2,000 miles of wilderness. And the reason you have never heard of most of them is because the food industry needed you to forget. Subscribe before we begin because some of these might change how you cook outdoors forever. Let us count them down. Number 25, ash cakes. Before there were proper pans on most wagon trains, trail cooks mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, shaped flat rounds, and buried them directly in hot campfire ashes. No skillet, no griddle, just dough and fire. The ashes formed a crust around the outside that peeled away to reveal steaming, slightly smoky bread underneath. Settlers heading west through Tennessee and Kentucky in the 1830s lived on these for weeks when flour was impossible to find. Cornmeal cost about 2 cents a pound at frontier trading posts, making ash cakes the cheapest meal a family could produce. Children ate them plain. Hunters wrapped strips of dried venison inside before burying them in the coals. The whole process took 15 minutes from mixing to eating. No rising time, no yeast, no waiting. The alkaline ash actually seasoned the bread, adding a subtle mineral flavor nothing else could replicate. Number 24, frontier coffee. Coffee on the frontier was not brewed, it was boiled hard. Trail cooks threw a fistful of coarsely ground beans into a pot of cold water and set it directly over the flames until it hit a rolling boil. Then they pulled it off and tossed in a crushed eggshell or a splash of cold water to drag the grounds to the bottom. The result was thick, bitter, and strong enough to keep a night watchman awake through a 12-hour prairie shift. By the 1850s, green coffee beans sold for about 12 cents a pound at trading posts along the Oregon Trail. Cowboys on cattle drives drank 6 to 8 cups a day and considered it a basic necessity. The eggshell trick was not superstition. Albumin proteins in the shell bond to bitter tannins and pull them to the bottom, a process food chemists now call clarification. Your average pour-over cannot replicate the heavy, smoky body that comes from boiling grounds directly over open flame. Number 23, hardtack. Flour, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt were mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, poked with holes, and baked slowly near the fire until every trace of moisture was gone. The result was a cracker so hard it could chip a tooth. But hardtack lasted for months without spoiling. Civil War soldiers called it worm castles, depending on how long it had been in the supply wagon. Pioneers soaked it in coffee, crumbled it into stews, or fried broken pieces in bacon grease to make a dish called skilly-gally. Families heading to Oregon packed 50 pounds per person for the 5-month journey. That tasteless cracker was the difference between starvation and survival. Number 22, son of a gun stew. When a cattle drive slaughtered a calf, nothing went to waste. The trail cook tossed heart, liver, kidneys, tongue, sweetbreads, and marrow gut into a Dutch oven with onions and whatever spices he had. The marrow gut was the key. That tube of partially digested milk from an unweaned calf gave the stew a creamy richness no other ingredient could provide. Cowboys along the Chisholm Trail in the 1870s considered this the finest meal on the drive, worth working an extra shift to earn a second helping. The stew simmered for hours over low coals, organ meats breaking down into a thick, savory gravy. Trail cooks who made a good son of a gun stew earned reputations that traveled from Texas to Montana. The recipe vanished almost completely when open-range cattle drives ended in the 1890s because the specific combination of fresh organ meats required an animal slaughtered that day. Number 21. Hoe cakes. The name tells you everything. Field workers in the colonial South literally cooked cornmeal batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over the fire. By the 1840s, hoe cakes had graduated to skillets, but the recipe stayed almost unchanged. Cornmeal, water, a little lard, and a hot greased pan. The batter spread thin and fried until the edges turned golden and crisp. A stack of hoe cakes with sorghum syrup was breakfast for millions of Americans from Virginia to the Pacific coast. George Washington reportedly ate hoe cakes drenched in butter every morning. These were not poor man's food alone. They were American food, period. The reason you do not see them today is simple. Pancake mix companies spent decades convincing Americans that breakfast required their product, not a bag of cornmeal costing a fraction of the price. Number 20. Pemmican. Native peoples across the Great Plains perfected this recipe over thousands of years, and frontier trappers adopted it because nothing else came close for portable survival food. Lean buffalo or venison was dried in thin strips over a smoky fire, pounded into powder using stones, mixed with rendered animal fat and sometimes dried berries, then pressed into dense cakes. A single pound contained roughly 3,500 calories and could last for years without spoiling. Hudson's Bay Company traders purchased tens of thousands of pounds annually from indigenous suppliers, fueling the entire fur trade economy. Lewis and Clark carried pemmican to the Pacific. No modern energy bar comes close to the caloric density. Pemmican vanished when the buffalo herds were destroyed in the 1870s, and the knowledge of making it properly nearly disappeared with the cultures that created it. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. The Dutch oven was the single most important piece of cooking equipment on the American frontier. Not the skillet, not the spit, the Dutch oven. A heavy cast iron pot with a flanged lid designed to hold hot coals on top, creating an oven effect in the middle of nowhere. Pioneer families paid between $1 and $3 for a good one in the 1840s, equivalent to a full day's wages, and guarded it like treasure. When a family crossed a swollen river and had to lighten the wagon, they threw out furniture before they threw out the Dutch oven. Trail cooks could bake biscuits, roast meat, stew beans, and even make cobbler in a single pot by adjusting where they placed the coals. More heat on the lid meant browning on top. More coals underneath meant boiling and frying. Mastering coal placement was the difference between a trail cook and a trail legend. Lewis and Clark carried multiple Dutch ovens across the continent. The Mormon pioneers listed them as essential in their published trail guides. When we lost the knowledge of cooking over open coals, we lost the skill that made these next recipes possible. Number 18. Army bean soup. The United States Army fed frontier soldiers on bean soup so often that veterans joked the recipe should have been printed on their discharge papers. Dried Navy beans soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with salt pork, onions, and water. A pound of dried beans cost about 4 cents in the 1860s and expanded to feed a dozen men. The salt pork was the secret. That chunk of cured fat rendered slowly into the broth, turning bland beans into something smoky and rich. Soldiers who had eaten nothing but hardtack for days lined up twice for a full ladle. Field manuals published by the War Department included precise instructions for preparation, making it one of the few frontier recipes actually written down and distributed at scale. Number 17. Bannock. Scottish and Irish settlers brought this flatbread across the Atlantic, and it became a staple of the northern frontier and every lumber camp from Minnesota to Oregon. It started with flour, baking powder, salt, and enough water to form a shaggy dough. Trail cooks wrapped the dough around a green stick and held it over the fire, rotating slowly until baked through. Others pressed it flat in a greased skillet. Mountain men like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson lived on bannock and jerky for months in the wilderness. The stick method was genius. Wrapping dough around a green branch meant you did not need a single piece of cookware, just flour, water, fire, and a tree. Mainstream America forgot bannock entirely when sliced bread arrived in 1928 and never looked back. Number 16. Spotted pup. Cowboys had a sweet tooth, and the trail cook who could produce dessert on the prairie earned loyalty money could not buy. Spotted pup was rice boiled with raisins and sweetened with brown sugar or molasses. The dark raisins scattered through white rice earned the name. A cattleman's journal from 1882 described men who had been cursing the rain going silent, scraping tin plates clean after the cook served spotted pup. That simple rice pudding, costing a few cents per serving, could turn the mood of an entire cattle drive. The dish vanished when the open-range era ended, and cowboys moved into bunkhouses with proper kitchens. Number 15. Jerky. Hunters sliced buffalo or venison into thin strips, rubbed them with salt, and hung them over a slow, smoky fire for 2 to 3 days. The combination of salt, smoke, and dehydration pulled moisture below the level where bacteria could survive. 10 pounds of venison reduced to about 2 pounds of jerky that lasted months. The Shoshone, Comanche, and Lakota peoples taught European settlers the techniques, including which woods produced the best flavor. Hickory and mesquite gave a deeper, sweeter smoke. Pine was avoided because resin turned the meat bitter. Commercial jerky today bears almost no resemblance to the frontier original. Modern versions are wet marinated and dehydrated in temperature-controlled ovens. The campfire smoke that gave frontier jerky its character cannot be duplicated industrially. Number 14. Vinegar pie, the frontier's shelf-stable tart. When the nearest fruit orchard was 500 miles away and lemons cost more than a day's wages, frontier women still managed to bake pie. Eggs, sugar, flour, butter, and a few tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. The vinegar provided tartness that mimicked lemon, creating a custard-like filling that set smooth and tangy. Every ingredient was shelf-stable and available at even the most remote trading post. Frontier diaries mention vinegar pie as celebration food, baked for birthdays, river crossings, and the first sight of the mountains. Children who had eaten nothing but beans and cornbread for weeks remembered that slice for the rest of their lives. The recipe survived in Appalachian communities well into the 20th century, but disappeared when refrigerated transport made fresh fruit available year-round. Second pattern break. Here is what nobody tells you about frontier cooking. The biggest innovation was not a recipe. It was fire management. A pioneer woman controlling a campfire understood thermodynamics better than most people using a modern range. She knew that hardwood coals, not open flame, produced the even heat needed for baking. She could judge temperature by holding her hand 6 inches above the coals and counting seconds. 2 seconds meant high heat for frying. 5 seconds meant moderate heat, perfect for stew. 8 seconds meant low heat, ideal for slow roasting. No thermometer, no temperature dial, just her hand and her experience. The recipes on this list were engineering solutions designed for an unpredictable heat source, and they worked because the women who cooked them understood fire in ways we have completely forgotten. Number 12, sourdough biscuits. Every serious frontier cook kept a sourdough starter alive like a family member. That bubbling crock of fermented flour and water was the only leavening available where you could not buy fresh yeast for months. Alaskan prospectors during the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush slept with their starters to keep them from freezing, earning the nickname sourdoughs that stuck for generations. Pull a lump of starter, mix with flour, salt, and lard, and bake in a Dutch oven with coals on top and bottom. 15 minutes later, you have golden, tangy biscuits with a rise that commercial baking powder could not match. The wild yeast cultures were unique to each region, capturing local bacteria that gave the bread a flavor tied to the land itself. When commercial yeast became widely available in the early 1900s, millions of starters were discarded. Each one was an irreplaceable colony of wild organisms developed over years of careful feeding. Number 11, fried salt pork and gravy. Salt pork was the bacon of the frontier, cheaper, fattier, and preserved with enough salt to last a year in a barrel. Trail cooks sliced it thick, soaked the slices to pull excess salt, then fried them until the edges crisped and the fat rendered clear. The crispy pork was set aside, and flour was added to the hot grease, stirred until golden. Milk or water followed, creating a thick white gravy poured over biscuits or cornbread. This was the most common breakfast on the American frontier from 1800 to 1900. A barrel of salt pork cost about $8, and it lasted a family 6 months. Sawmill gravy, cream gravy, country gravy, every name traces back to that same skillet of rendered salt pork fat thickened with flour. Number 10. Succotash. Long before European settlers arrived, indigenous peoples across the eastern woodlands grew corn, beans, and squash together in the Three Sisters system. Succotash, from the Narragansett language, combined corn kernels and shell beans simmered together, sometimes with bear fat or venison. The corn provided carbohydrates, the beans provided protein, and together they formed a nutritionally complete meal. Frontier families carried dried corn and beans specifically to make succotash on the trail. The dish sustained Plymouth Colony through its first winters and fed pioneer families crossing the Great Plains 3 centuries later. It vanished when canned vegetables replaced dried ones, and cooking 2 simple ingredients together seemed too plain for modern tastes. Number 9. Cowboy coffee bread. When flour was scarce and a cook had leftover coffee, cold coffee replaced water in a basic cornbread recipe. The result was darker, richer bread with a slight bitterness that paired perfectly with bean stew. Trail cooks along the Goodnight-loving trail in the 1860s made this regularly because wasting anything on the frontier was unthinkable. The tannins in the coffee also acted as a mild preservative, keeping the bread edible a day longer than plain cornbread. A whole batch used ingredients worth less than 3 cents. Number 8. Apple butter. When orchards produced more fruit than could be eaten fresh, entire communities gathered for an apple butter boiling. Bushels of apples were peeled, cored, and cooked down in copper kettles over open fires, stirred constantly for up to 12 hours with long wooden paddles. Sugar, cinnamon, and cloves went in during the final hours. The slow cooking concentrated the fruit sugars until the mixture turned dark, glossy, and thick enough to spread without dripping. A single boiling produced enough to last a family through winter. The communal nature, neighbors taking turns stirring through the night, made it as much a social gathering as food preservation. The concentrated sugar and acid created an environment where bacteria could not survive. Frontier food science was understood through practice, not textbooks. Number 7. Plank-cooked fish. When frontier settlers camped near rivers, they cooked fresh, caught fish using a method borrowed from native peoples that modern science says no oven can match. A trout or salmon was split open, pinned to a thick hardwood plank, usually oak, cedar, or hickory, and propped at an angle beside a blazing fire. The radiant heat cooked the fish slowly, while the plank smoked gently underneath, infusing the flesh with delicate sweetness. Food scientists confirmed that this indirect method produces the Maillard reaction at lower surface temperatures than direct grilling, creating complex flavor compounds without the bitterness of char. The gentle smoking adds phenolic compounds that both flavor and preserve. No kitchen broiler, no gas grill, and no oven can replicate the combination of radiant campfire heat and slow wood smoke. The physics require open flame and open air. Settlers along the Columbia River in the 1840s described plank-cooked salmon as the finest meal on the entire Oregon Trail. Number 6. Corn Dodgers. Cornmeal mixed with boiling water, a little salt, and a spoonful of lard, shaped into small oblong lumps and baked hard on a flat stone beside the fire. They traveled in saddlebags for days without crumbling. Civil War soldiers carried corn dodgers when supply lines collapsed. The trick was the boiling water. Pouring it over cornmeal gelatinized the starch, binding the dough into a structure that held together without eggs or flour. That technique, understood by cooks who had never heard the word gelatinization, made portable bread possible from almost nothing. Burgoo. In Kentucky and across the Ohio River Valley, community gatherings meant burgoo, a massive open-fire stew that fed hundreds from a single iron kettle. Squirrel, rabbit, venison, turkey, and beef simmered with corn, tomatoes, potatoes, and beans for up to 24 hours. The cook tended the fire through the night, stirring with a paddle the length of an oar. Burgoo was the centerpiece of political rallies, church picnics, and harvest celebrations. The recipe could not be scaled down. It required a crowd to justify and a crowd to consume. When American social life moved indoors, burgoo lost its purpose. You cannot make it for 4 people. It demands 50. Number 4. Spit-roasted venison. A venison haunch impaled on a green hardwood spit, suspended between 2 forked sticks over a low coal bed, rotated slowly for 3 to 4 hours. The outer crust sealed, trapping juices while dripping fat flavored the meat. A whole haunch fed a wagon camp of 30. Children were assigned to turn the spit in shifts. The smell carried a quarter-mile across the prairie. By the 1830s, venison was the most consumed meat on the western frontier, and the open-fire spit roast was how most of it was cooked. The method vanished as deer populations crashed from overhunting, and iron cook stoves replaced open hearths. Number 3. Chuckwagon chili. Before chili became Texas competition food, it was a frontier survival recipe. Trail cooks dried beef and pounded it with rendered tallow and dried chili peppers into dense bricks that traveled without spoiling. At camp, they crumbled the bricks into boiling water with wild onions and garlic. No beans, no tomatoes, just meat, fat, and peppers. The capsaicin warmed cowboys during cold night watches, and it acted as a preservative. A single brick weighed less than a pound and produced enough stew for 3 men. The recipe originated with Tejano and Mexican vaquero cooks, and it spread north along the cattle trails. Number 2. Campfire cobbler. The Dutch oven turned the frontier dessert problem into a triumph. Trail cooks lined the bottom with a simple batter of flour, sugar, and baking powder. Then they poured canned or stewed fruit, peaches being the prize, directly on top. Coals went on top and underneath, and in 30 minutes, the batter had risen around the fruit into a golden, bubbling crust. A cobbler baked in the Wyoming Territory over buffalo chips tasted like civilization. Cowhands and cavalry soldiers wrote home about campfire cobbler more often than almost any other meal. The heat from coals on the lid browned the top, while the bottom baked from below, creating a texture no conventional oven could precisely duplicate. A tin of peaches cost about 15 cents. That single tin, transformed by a free campfire, became the recipe men remembered decades after the trail was behind them. Number 1. Biscuits and red-eye gravy. This was the meal that built the American frontier. The recipe appeared at more campfires, chuckwagons, homestead kitchens, and trail camps than any other dish in the westward expansion. Biscuits were made from flour, lard, salt, and baking powder or sourdough starter, cut thick and baked golden in a Dutch oven. The gravy came from frying a thick slab of country ham in cast iron, then deglazing the salty caramelized pan drippings with a pour of leftover black coffee. That coffee hit the hot fat and sizzled, lifting every bit of flavor from the iron. The result was a thin, dark, intensely savory gravy, equal parts bitter, salty, and smoky. You split a hot biscuit, ladled that red-eye gravy over both halves, and ate with your hands. Civil War soldiers, cattle drive cowboys, mountain men, gold rush prospectors, and homesteading families all claimed it as their own. Red-eye gravy does not appear on most American tables today because it requires 3 things the modern kitchen eliminated: a properly cured country ham with enough salt and smoke to caramelize, a seasoned cast iron skillet that adds its own layer of flavor, and campfire boiled coffee strong enough to stand up to the pork fat. We replaced cured ham with deli slices. We replaced iron with non-stick. We replaced boiled coffee with drip machines. And we lost the greatest breakfast the American frontier ever produced. Try one of these this weekend. Light a fire, not a burner. Make ash cakes or bannock. Boil your coffee in a pot with a crushed eggshell. Bake a cobbler in a Dutch oven with coals on the lid. Then come back and tell me which one you tried first. Drop it in the comments.